Are you neurodivergent, and do you struggle with isolation and loneliness? Hi, I'm Essie. I'm an autistic and ADHD therapist. Today, I want to talk to you about the reality of being a neurodivergent person in a neurotypical world and how isolating it can often be. For context, I grew up undiagnosed as an autistic and ADHDer, and I didn't receive any accommodations. I didn't receive any information about my difficulties. I didn't have any insight about my difficulties. And I just assumed, like many of us do when we're not diagnosed or educated about neurodivergence, that my struggles were a result of a personal flaw or shortcoming. I didn't understand social norms. I always wanted to monologue about my interests, whatever I happened to be passionate about at the time. I didn't understand the concept of social reciprocity, so my interactions were often very one-sided. I had sensory difficulties like sensitivity to tags in my clothing. My own clothes would chafe me often, and I had attentional difficulties. While I could focus in class, I often found that my attention was wandering out the window. Most of school seemed boring and irrelevant to me, the exception being creative writing. I loved English as a subject, and I loved storytelling. From a young age, I would often write fantastic stories set in other worlds. It was a form of escapism in which I could leave behind a reality that was often confusing and boring for one that was much more exciting, inviting, and understandable. Because I acted different, I had a bit of an American accent, and apparently many autistics learn their pronunciation of words from TV, and I was consuming a lot of American cartoons as a child. I stuck out. Growing up in Australia with a slightly American accent often led to me being singled out, and my motor skills differences meant that I walked and behaved in unusual ways, and so I was often bullied. When I look back at my childhood, all I can remember is this profound sense of loneliness, that I couldn't understand other people, that I was weird and some part of me was completely unacceptable to others, and that I was forever condemned to isolation. Looking back, I also recognize that my parents exhibited signs of undiagnosed neurodivergence, and they themselves had an insecure attachment style, which manifested in our relationship. It didn't feel like they were attuned to my needs. When I struggled, they had difficulty with empathizing and showing compassion. They seemed very consumed with their own interests, and they were very rigid in their thinking and limited in their outward displays of affection and support. For me, it felt like I couldn't get any solace, comfort, or understanding at home, and then I was forced to go to school where I struggled to find peer acceptance. There were some positive experiences, a few good friends who helped me feel grounded, helped me feel something like normal and accepted, and teachers who went above and beyond to bring me into the fold, to make me feel accepted, to help me when I struggled academically. And because of them, I often got good grades. But the cumulative effect of having caregivers who weren't attuned to my needs and peers and social environments that seemed actively hostile led to me developing complex PTSD. Complex PTSD is different from single incident shock trauma, which is classical PTSD. It refers to chronic, ongoing relational trauma across a period of time. And while not being accepted might not be considered a traditional form of trauma, if it happens consistently and in many aspects of life, it's likely to be experienced by someone as traumatic. In response to this trauma, I developed a common symptom, which was a tyrannical inner critic. This tyrannical inner critic forever lived in my head. He still exists today, and he sits there, makes constant commentary, criticisms, negative observations, catastrophizing, warning me that terrible things are coming, that I'm a failure, that no matter what I do, I suck, that I'm responsible for all misfortune that comes upon me, that I'm constantly making mistakes, that I can get nothing right. And it goes on and on and on with the negative criticisms and the attacks. This critic served a function when I was growing up. It warned me against taking any risks because those risks could lead to real-world consequences. For example, if I got out of my chair because I wanted to fidget, I'd get in trouble with a teacher. If I blurted out something socially inappropriate, I would be punished by my peers, mocked, criticized, bullied, and excluded. If I spoke what I saw to be the truth, it would be seen by others as rude, blunt, and insensitive. Like so many neurodivergents, I learned through aversive treatment. I was exposed to many negative experiences that conditioned me to not take any risks, to withdraw, to isolate, and to avoid other people where possible. By the time I reached high school, I completely kept to myself. I would spend my lunch hours in the library reading books. Any chance I got, I would retreat into a novel to escape reality. I tried not to engage in social interactions. The only time I spoke up was in class to share knowledge. But as it turned out, I was often perceived to be a little Mr. Know-it-all. People believed I had a superiority complex and perceived myself to be better than other people. There were all these impressions that others had about me that I don't think aligned with my inner experience of myself. Based on me having a blank expression, flat affect, I always seemed angry. People made assumptions about my mood. They made assumptions about my state of mind and who I thought I was. And if they took the time to get to know me, they would see that that was not the case. And I had multiple social interactions in which people talked to me and said, "Oh, actually, you're a really cool guy. You seem pretty normal." I mean, normal is an ableist term, but it was validating at the time because it showed to me that they had these preconceived ideas or prejudices about me based on my appearance. And if they were willing to give me the time of the day to treat me with a bit of empathy and compassion, they could see that I was a person with many great qualities. So I continued in my isolation, waiting for the day that I could get out of school. During this time, there was a lot of upheaval in my family. There was some domestic violence, and I increasingly felt unsafe there, as much as I felt unsafe in the outer world at school. The only thing I had to keep me sane was this tyrannical inner critic who was constantly telling me to toe a line. And if I towed this line, I could remain safe and I could get out intact. And this led to perfectionism about myself, my academic performance, and I became something of a young workaholic, constantly studying any free time I had, barring the time I spent indulging in novels, video games, or writing my own stories. The perfectionism served in my mind a function. By being the best version of myself, by getting good grades, I could leave school, graduate, go into college, do a program I wanted, and have material success. I could show all those bullies and the people who picked on me that I wasn't a bad person, that I was better than them. And even today, that part still lives on in me. This desire to prove myself to other people, to be successful, to validate myself in the wake of the slings and arrows of ableist society. As an ADHDer, I struggled with executive dysfunction, but I taught myself a structure and a routine so that I could perform academically and that I could be successful. And this was only possible through this relentless self-criticism. You have to do better. You have to be more efficient. You have to be more organized. I internalized the criticisms of others about my executive dysfunction and transformed it into a state of hyperproductivity. But even once I left school and made my way out into the world, I still struggled to understand other people, to know what was socially acceptable in my interactions with others, to connect with others and have reciprocal relationships. It always felt that I was somehow missing the mark, that I was misreading the room, that I was saying something inappropriate, and my inability to hold on to friends who were good for me showed that. I often formed friendships with other oddballs or social rejects or people with toxic behavior who would then see me as an easy mark and would pick on me or use me for their own purposes. In the absence of social support and connection, I threw myself with greater vigor into my perfectionism and workaholism. I was always writing a new screenplay, a new novel, coming up with an idea for a new video game, a lot of half-baked ideas, and a lot of ideas that I actually pursued to fruition. I would complete the project, and once I completed the project, I'd be scrambling to find something else to fill the time, because what else did I have? Where could I spend that time if I didn't have friends or people who accepted me? And it seemed that every time I went out into the world and tried to connect with others, I was rejected or I was mistreated. And I became very futile in my mindset about my ability to actually have connections. In hindsight, I recognized that my workaholism was also driven by reward deficiency syndrome. Reward deficiency syndrome refers to a dopamine dysfunction in the brain of people who are ADHD that leads to this constant need for stimulation. And rather than indulging in the more dangerous or risky forms of stimulation like drug use, I treated work as a form of supply. If I could be extra efficient and extra productive, I would get a little kick. And I was also indulging in my neurodivergent passions like writing. I became so fixated on being productive that I very rarely wanted to rip this dopamine drip out. I was getting a constant supply of stimulation and therefore fulfillment from the task, even as my social life continued to founder. I was still clinging to this idea that I was somehow going to make it and become successful and recognized by others as worthy of praise and celebration, and that this would translate to social acceptance and material acceptance. Never mind that in the interim, I was still very isolated and still very lonely, and I felt perpetually misunderstood and like I was cosmically condemned to a life of solitude. It didn't help that I still didn't understand the ins and outs of human relationships, or that other people, while I longed for their presence, could be confusing to me, and they could also be very annoying. I have misophonia, which is a sensitivity to human noises, so being around people I can only do for certain amounts of time, and I also have a very small social battery, so it can get sapped from just an hour or 2 hours of social interaction. I still didn't have a diagnosis, and I still didn't understand why I was struggling with these things. The only way of understanding it that I had was negative messages I'd had from caregivers and other people in society, that I was antisocial, that I was too sensitive, that I was too intolerant, that I hated people, which I don't think was necessarily true. And I also think it was an overgeneralization and mischaracterization of the nature of my struggles. Once I had a diagnosis, I could reframe all of this, but until then, there was something wrong with me as I saw it. I kind of yo-yoed between this and other people are too sensitive to my remarks, that they're weird and don't make sense, that they don't like to hear the truth, that they are inherently deceptive, that they're dishonest, they're hypocritical, that they have double standards, as is often perceived by people who are neurodivergent and are straight shooters in how they act and perceive the world. And adding to this was my struggles understanding my sexual identity. I knew I was gay, but I also didn't have a label for how my sexuality would express itself. Now I see myself as demisexual, gray ace flux, and I didn't have labels for these things. And even though I had the label for being gay, I still felt marginalized by that identity, because being queer in this world makes you a minority member, and minority members are often targeted by the majority. Intersectionality understands that our many identities intersect and often conflict, and having multiple minority identities can lead to increased minority stress. Minority stress refers to the multiple complex stressors that people with minority identities are exposed to when they have to navigate a majority society. Even after I got my diagnosis for autism at 25 and ADHD at 35, I understood myself, but I still didn't fully understand other people, and the practical obstacles, such as having a small social battery, remained. I also spent all of my adulthood stuck in this perfectionistic mindset, in this workaholic habit, and I found it very hard to shake it. And the downside was, even as I was understanding myself and growing as a person and growing in my capacity to connect with others, I was still addicted to my isolated lifestyle, to constantly being productive, to working on my projects to the exclusion of social relationships. I found every time I tried to abandon my workaholic habit, I was losing my source of stimulation, and I'd feel myself crash. I'd question my own worth. What was I doing with my life? What had I amounted to? Was there any point in living? And periodically, when I stop working, that's what comes up for me. And I know it's a brain chemical dysfunction related to reward deficiency syndrome, but even knowing that doesn't stop the struggle. I still end up questioning myself and where I am in my life. I start feeling profoundly lonely in that all these years have passed, and I know that I'm neurodivergent, I'm empowered, I have the life that I wanted to create for myself, but I'm still not connected to people the way I want to be connected. I see this also in the lives of my clients who express to me this feeling of profound isolation, of having not connected with other peoples, of having found their crowd. They may struggle to connect with neurotypicals. They may also struggle to connect with other neurodivergents. Now, this is a topic for another video, because even relationships between neurodivergents aren't all smooth sailing. Suffice to say, relationships in general are very hard for neurodivergents as they have to navigate their own needs as much as they do the other person's. And I want to note here that I've made a conscientious effort to not isolate. I've joined clubs, I've started my own social groups, I've led those groups, I've reached out to people, I continue to reach out to people to be part of something like a community. I make concerted efforts. I never stop and say, woe is me, I'm lonely, I'm isolated. But even after all those efforts, at the end of the day, I look at what I have and I think, I have some pretty solid friends strewn across the world. I know that they're there for me, but I still feel at my core lonely. Like many people, I fixate on this idea of finding a romantic partner who will fulfill that need that has been unmet. And I don't think that's a realistic idea either. I think having a broad array of people in your life who can meet different needs is the answer to this problem. And indulging in this idea of romantic fulfillment is telling yourself a lie, essentially. I could see having a partner, possibly someone who is also neurodivergent, share in my experiences and in my struggles being helpful, but I don't think that's all one needs to feel fulfilled. But one of the challenges in terms of being neurodivergent and being isolated is the fear of reaching out. We've been rejected, shunned, bullied, and excluded for so long. We've had a series of negative experiences. It's hard not to be pessimistic and fatalistic about our ability to connect with others and to just avoid the possibility altogether. Given that many of us have anxiety, we tend to engage in avoidance as a general rule, meaning we don't go into social environments, we stay away from situations that are perceived to be high risk, like let's say social avenues or social venues, parties, conferences, coffee shops, because practically speaking, we might deal with sensory overload, we might feel an increase in social anxiety because there's a risk of us not meeting social expectations and being rejected. And this is especially the case if you have rejection-sensitive dysphoria, this sensitivity to perceived or real rejection, failure, criticism, especially if other people are there to see that or experience your failure. But hope springs eternal. I'm a big believer that one has to keep on trying, that one has to be even blindly optimistic about one's social prospects and keep putting oneself out there, keep trying to find your community, finding people who share your interests, who share your values, who you can connect with, who you can share compassion, empathy, and understanding with. No matter how much you've struggled in the past, no matter how much you've relied on avoidance, perfectionism, workaholism, or other forms of distraction from one's loneliness, there is always a possibility that you can find people who will understand you. The key to finding those people is first finding yourself, understanding your needs, learning assertive communication, learning how to have healthy boundaries and not engage in codependent behaviors, knowing your own value so you don't engage in relationships with people who are incapable of meeting you where you're at, respecting you, understanding your boundaries, and contributing in a reciprocal way to a relationship. If you have a broken internal compass, and let's face it, many of us do where it comes to relationships, your goal should be to repair that compass so you can find the right kind of people. Having caregivers who didn't attune to your needs and a society that rejected you can lead to insecure attachment, can lead to you pursuing people that aren't going to fulfill your needs. Understanding your attachment style can also be a helpful way to understand your needs and how to orient yourself when you pursue relationships. Recognizing the burden of complex PTSD, knowing that you might be engaging in avoidance because you have an overly active, tyrannical inner critic. Reflecting on how you've engaged in avoidance, such as workaholism or perfectionism, as an escape from the possibility of failure, and understanding that failure is par for the course and that you don't have to be valued solely upon your accomplishments. You can be valued for who you are. Growing up, you might not have been valued for who you are because people rejected you for being neurodivergent, but there's a strong possibility that there are people out there who will accept you for who you are. I think it's worthwhile to continue pursuing your passions if it brings you fulfillment, but not to the exclusion of relationships, as I often did. Many of us engage in these distractions because we have this belief that we're bad, that we're deficient, and that if we do good, we somehow will become good, and through that, become accepted by others. but this is an oversimplistic view of ourselves, and it doesn't do us any justice. It's hard to believe that you have inherent worth, that you're worthy of unconditional love, if all the messages you've received up to this point go counter to this. And this is why it can be so hard to come into an abundance mindset, to see the world as one full of possibility, to see relationships as a never-ending horizon of connection. But if you're willing to take those risks, if you're willing to put yourself out there, if you're willing to try again and again and again, no matter how many negative experiences that happen, the chances are at some point, something will connect, something will click, and you'll have the outcome you desire. Know that you're not alone in your isolation and loneliness. Know that many of us walk this path and continue to walk this path. And as lonely as you feel, you're in good company. If you found this video helpful, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and share it with anyone you think might find it helpful. This goes a long way in helping other people like yourself find my content and benefit from it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.